Welcome to Federation's Generations, the ultimate auditory voyage where we bridge the stellar gap between Star Trek, the original series, and Star Trek, the next generation. I'm your host, Mr. G, joined by the insightful Dr. B, with our intergalactic producer, Johnny M at the helm. Each episode will embark on a comparative mission, juxtaposing a classic episode from Star Trek, the original series, with its counterpart from Star Trek, the next generation. We'll delve into the writing that sparked our imaginations, the acting performances that captured our hearts, the set design that built worlds beyond our solar system, and the music that scored our adventures across the stars. But it's not just about what we see on screen. We'll also explore the historical and cultural context of the eras that birthed these iconic series. From the hopeful and turbulent days of the 60s, to the transformative decades of the 80s and 90s. We'll examine how the time shaped the stories and how the stories reflected the times. Join us as we analyze, discuss, and perhaps even debate, bringing you a fresh perspective on the episodes you know and love. This is Federation's Generations, signing on for an interstellar journey through time, space, and television history. Engage. All right, Dr. B, good morning. How are you?
All right. Thank you. Good morning. I'm doing great. How are you?
Pretty good. So today we're talking about two episodes. The first episode is going to be the original series episode, Whom Gods Destroy, which was season 3, episode 14, which aired in January of 1969, before even I was born, believe it or not. The second episode will be the new Next Generation episode will be The High Ground, season 3, episode 12, which the air date was January 31st, 1990. Well within my lifetime there. I remember that year quite well. And let's for the beginning, let's talk about how we decided to do this podcast. So this grew out of a trip that we took last year to a Star Trek convention in Las Vegas.
Yeah. So for those who may be unaware, for the past at least 20 years, probably longer, there's been a pretty large Star Trek convention in Las Vegas every year, typically around the end of July, beginning of August, and draws thousands of fans from all over the world, men, women, and children, families coming together. So Mr. G and I decided to venture out last summer and had a great time there. And
podcasts seem to have a prominent role at the convention. There were many people that were parts of various Star Trek podcasts, and they had a very visible presence. And so you and I got to talking about, if we had to do a podcast, what would it be? And it turns out that we're two different types of Star Trek fans because we sort of come a bit from two different eras. And to explain me, so I'm someone who's of a certain age, mid-50s, we'll call it. And I started watching Star Trek like many people my age did on syndicated television in the mid-1970s as a child. And anyone who's my age can remember far back, we didn't really have cable. We had the 3 channels, we had PBS, and maybe we had a syndicated channel if you lived in a large city. And Star Trek would come on either in that slot right after the national news finished at 7 p.m. and before primetime started, or it would show up like at the end of the night, sort of after the local news in the evening and before they actually had the sign off with the American flag, which again, only people my age will remember when TV signed off at midnight.
Yeah, I don't remember that. I'm a little bit younger.
Anyway, and back then, what was interesting was we didn't have anything that we could reference. There might have been a few books here or there, but you learned each episode as, okay, the episode where Kirk and Spock do this and that happens. And you couldn't really reference it. Maybe if you were focused, you'd catch the name of the series, but you really didn't, sort of keep a list or anything. I imagine some people must have kept a list. But what would happen was the Star Trek was on every single night. So you saw all 79 episodes in succession, and then they just start right all over again. The other thing we had back then was the Star Trek Marathon. So those would be special events that usually, one of the channels would put on, usually during the weekend. You start on Friday night at like 6 showing Star Trek, and then they just keep on showing episodes all that evening and then all through the day. So you could turn it into an event. You get together with your friends, order some pizza, and watch Star Trek. So that's how I became a Star Trek fan. And of course, the Next Generation didn't come along until I was in college. So I am first and foremost an original series fan. And that's a little bit different from, I think, your perspective, Dr. B. You want to talk about how you came to Star Trek?
So when I was growing up, Star Trek ran in my market on the future WB/CW, or I guess maybe future UPN. All the letters get a bit messy sometimes, but basically when I was a kid, I would have Saturday afternoons where the original series episode would air, maybe mid to late afternoon, and then kind of lead into the newest episode of the Next Generation, all on the same channel. Some of my older, family would sometimes join me watching at least the original series episode, and then I'd kind of be on, kind of on my own to watch the Next Generation. So my experience was, not these marathons, not the, certainly not the original airings in real time, but kind of like we're doing today, a Next Generation episode following an original series episode, kind of jam-packed together into a Saturday afternoon and evening.
And so while we were at this convention, we talked about a podcast that would take an original series episode and a Next Generation episode and compare them. But not only compare them as regards acting and plot points and writing, but also to take a look at how the culture and times affected the episodes and how what was going on in the world at the time somehow was infused into the very nature of the writing and the series and the wardrobe and the set design. So the first episode we're looking at is Whom Gods Destroy. And again, the air date was January 3, 1969. So it was written mostly during 1968. And I'm just going to give a synopsis of the story, and then we're going to talk about the different various aspects of it. So this is the lead-in is, of course, Kirk giving his captain's log, and he explains that they're going to this planet called Elba 2. Now, the choice of the name Elba is quite interesting because, of course, Elba was the first island that Napoleon was exiled to. Of course, the one that he escaped from before the Battle of Waterloo. But again, it sets this issue up of issues of people with maybe megalomania or delusions of grandeur, and that's going to show up later on in the story. Anyway, so they go to Elba 2, and it's Kirk and Spock, so everyone else is back up on the Enterprise. Now, Elba 2 is an interesting planet in that it has a poisonous atmosphere, of course. And not only that, but there's a shield around the facility. So as soon as Kirk arrives and he meets up with the governor, or who he thinks is the governor of the colony, this governor says, "Oh, I've turned on the shield, so I've locked you in." So, and at that point, it seemed to be an innocent comment, but of course, it's going to get very sinister quite shortly. So they start to walk through the compound, and they come upon an Orion woman who says to Kirk and Spock, she's like, "Well, that's not the real governor. You guys are being fooled." And Kirk is like, "What are you talking about?" Spock's like, "Sounds a little bit credible to me." So Spock's sort of onto something. And then they walk over to the next cell, and it turns out that, yes, that's not really the governor. That was the shape-shifting inmate, Garth of Izar. Now, Garth of Izar has a pretty interesting backstory. He was a starship captain, not only a starship captain, but a starship fleet captain. Do you know the difference, Dr. B?
I confess, I do not know the difference.
So captain of a starship is in command of a starship. A fleet captain can be promoted to command of several starships. So you recall in different times in the Star Trek universe, you've seen 2 or 3 starships operating at once. Those would be commanded by a fleet captain, but not at the level of an admiral. So this is the highest level of captain that you can get in Starfleet.
At that time. And you also in the original series have other ranks that don't quite translate into future series like Commodore. Commodore,
yeah, which you don't really see in the Next Generation, but you do see in the original series.
Right.
I believe Commodore is above fleet captain.
Okay.
If I know my Star Trek right, I'm sure someone in the comments will correct us if I'm wrong. So anyway, Garth of Izar has a pretty interesting backstory. So he was this decorated Starfleet captain, and at some point in time, he was injured, I believe, and again, fans correct me on this, the Battle of Axnar. And he then went to Antos 4. And the people of Antos 4 are known for their great benevolence and their skill at being able to repair people. And they taught Garth how to repair his body parts, basically, that had been injured. And he was able over time to extend that to being able to transform his entire body to look like somebody else. So as Kirk is now, as he's showing Kirk through this facility as the Governor Corey, it turns out that it's not actually Governor Corey, it's Garth who shapeshifts himself in Governor Corey. And then they see Governor Corey in the cell, right? So Garth of Izar basically says, okay, you're going to give me your starship, and I'm going to go out and I'm going to conquer the galaxy. And I got to say, the performance by the actor here is just absolutely amazing because he really goes over the top. But it's really something, it's very entertaining, something to behold. Anyway, Kirk is like, no way you can do that. My crew's not going to listen to you. And of course, Garth says, they will if I look like you. And then he shapeshifts into Kirk. Now, what's interesting is how they do the shapeshifting, right? Because this is long before CGI.
Right.
So what they do, it's interesting how they do it. They just get very fuzzy. The screen gets very fuzzy, goes completely out of focus for a second, and then gets back into focus. And when it's back into focus, then he's shapeshifted. So Garth, as Kirk, goes to a control room and calls up to Scotty. Now, it's very interesting. Scotty's in command, which is always a treat because Scotty is one of the most no-nonsense Starfleet officers that you have. And when he's in charge, there's no hemming and hawing and everything. It's very down to brass tacks. And, it's interesting. Scotty would have made a very good captain.
Scotty did indeed become a captain at some point, but of course, engineering was always near and dear to his heart. But I think you have a point about how in the original series, just seeing him here and there, typically because I think Kirk and Spock hold the ranks, and then
he's third. Scotty's third in command.
Third in command, yeah.
And he really is very no nonsense. So whether or not he actually became a captain of a Star Trek ship, he certainly had captain skills. Anyway, Scotty's sticking to orders, and before Kirk had left, he'd said, I'm going to give you a code, and if you don't get the code response, don't let me beam back up. I believe the code is Queens to Queens level 3, which is a chess illusion.
Yeah, not even just chess, like what the original series, among many other things, is famous for, the 3D chess.
Yes, 3D chess, level 3. So then what happens is Garth, of course, although he looks like Kirk and sounds like Kirk, doesn't have the correct code. And Scotty's like, hey, give me the code. That's what you order me to do. And Garth doesn't have it. So Garth, as Kirk, says, okay, I'll call you back. And sort of hangs up the phone on him. Then you have what I believe is one of the greatest Bill Shatner acting moments in all of Star Trek, because the director must have just gone to him and said, Bill, you're Garth, you're mentally ill, you're a megalomaniac, you're grandiose. Just cut loose, go crazy, do whatever you need to do, because Shatner just goes wild. He's pounding the floor. He grabs two guys, shakes them around. He's pounding on the walls, right? And then he goes and pounds the floor again, yelling and screaming. So much that when he transforms back into Garth, his bling starts to fall off. So it's like one of the most out of control Shatner performances. Talk about chewing up the scenery, literally chewing up the scenery. And I don't know, when you saw that, you saw that moment, what were your thoughts?
Well, you were talking about how these special effects, how they, long before proper CGI existed, they had to really improvise with the camera focus and the fading in and fading out in order to get the shape-shifting effect. I really admired how for this particular episode, you have not only Shatner as the series regular and lead, but you also have the guest star, Steve Ilnhat. It seemed to me that aside from just the traditional Shatner, heavy acting, it took two of them, and the director and everyone else coordinating these scenes with the shape shifting where Garth is throwing one of his tantrums, and so both actors have to be not only there for the special effects but also to carry out the emotions that the other one was experiencing before the shapeshift. So I admired that throughout this episode.
Yeah, it's a great exercise for an actor because, both, and we'll talk about this later, both Shatner and Nimoy get to play another person looks like themselves. But Steve Innott, and I pulled out some information from him on Wikipedia, was a rather prolific TV actor in the 1960s. He was on a number of different shows, Name of the Game, Silent Force, Cimarron Strip, and in a few other movies here, In Like Flint, Hour of the Gun, Zigzag, mostly playing a villain. Unfortunately, one of the reasons we don't know that much about him is because he passed away in 1972. Oh. So this was unfortunately near the end of his career. But what I will say is Mr. Illnott, sorry, I just want to pronounce it the right way, really gave it his all for this particular performance. Anyway, so Garth realizes he has to get the code from Kirk, right? So he sets up this dinner, and this is one of the craziest dinners in all of Star Trek. So they have set up a dinner, and they have the usual sort of Star Trek table settings and food, the weirdly colored alcohol, or you assume it's alcohol, the sort of Star Trek type sort of gumdrop-like food, sort of multicolored and green and blue.
And different shapes, kind of like...
Exactly, very different shapes. Like in the Next Generation, food looks sort of like food, or sometimes it'd be alien. But in the original series, it looked like some sort of, preformed thing. So, it wasn't like normal food that you would
It always made me think of Play-Doh, kind of, like if you were a kid. And
yeah, exactly. It looked quite a bit like Play-Doh. Yeah, yeah. So anyway, they go to this dinner, and a number of things happen at this dinner. First of all, Marta, the Orion, who seems to be sort of dating or the girlfriend of Garth, sort of, is hanging out and hanging around Kirk and sort of, showing interest. And that gets Garth jealous. And Garth sort of has a back and forth with her. Then she says she's going to quote a poem that she's written, but it turns out to actually be Shakespeare. And so there's all this back and forth with them. Then Garth and Kirk get into this conversation about, what he did in Starfleet. And Garth is like, oh, Starfleet's useless. They don't get anything done. And Kirk says, no, they're humanitarians and they've done great things for this galaxy. And, that's how, Spock and I became brothers, which is the first time he's ever said something like that. So this is actually a pretty interesting moment in Star Trek where, Kirk says, oh, Spock and I have this very close relationship. And this is one of the series where that's really established. Now, this is season 3, right? So we've seen Spock and Kirk together for a while, but we never really understood, Spock was first officer, Kirk was captain. Now you get to see some of the depths of the relationship here.
Yeah, and it's interesting for my viewing of it. Spock's response is kind of because it was a little bit of Kirk putting him on the spot. Like they were just talking with Garth, and Kirk was making his case, and he was like, "Oh, and by the way, this guy is like my brother to me." And Spock, it's like, "Oh, Spock, what do you think?"
Figuratively,
yeah, it's logical.
So Spock playing it cool, but then Spock and Garth. Oh, then there's the dancing. So Marta decides that she's going to dance. And actually, this is what caused some problems for this episode. We're going to talk about what happened to these episodes down the line and how they were received in certain countries, particularly the United Kingdom. So the dance was, she does this alluring sort of dance, and Spock has an interesting comment about how it reminds him of how children dance in Vulcan, and, so he's had sort of a derisive comment. So then Spock and Garth get into this, back and forth about Garth's particular actions and his philosophy about wanting to take over the whole world. And you know that something's going on, like when Spock has those folded arms and is just sort of going at it with the logic. And so Garth takes about 5 minutes of this and he says, "Out, you animal." So Spock just gets under his skin super quick and he has to go. Yeah. So anyway, so Garth realizes, okay, this is going to be a bit of a problem, getting this code. Then we have a very interesting scene, which I remembered from my youth. And the few things about this episode that stuck with me, and that gets to some of the issues about, whether or not these series should have been censored for kids, right? So there's a torture scene. So Garth realizes that he's not going to get the code easily. So he says he's going to, put them into this torture chair. So this torture chair is a chair that originally had been used to try to cure patients, right? So it's some sort of device with a sort of these two lollipop things that colored lights around the head.
Right.
And what happens is he puts Governor Corey in the chair first, and Spock's like, Kirk's like, oh no, stop this. And he's like, okay, Kirk, well now you're going in the chair. And of course, Kirk does not go easily. He starts throwing some fists and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. But finally they get him in the chair. Anyway, of course, Kirk doesn't crack. He's like, no, I'm not going to tell you anything. So, it's very much like, that doesn't work. So, Garth is getting more and more and more frustrated. And the one thing I noticed, we'll get to this when we get to set design, is that this chair, I don't know that they looked at all the aspects of design of it, but there's a couple of unusual things, including a power cord that you can see in one of the scenes that I don't know they were quite like covering all their bases on that.
Bit of a goof.
Yeah, a bit of a goof. So anyway, so back up on the Enterprise, they're trying to figure out different ways to, get to the captain because they realize something's gone wrong. So, they're like, okay, can we shoot through? Can we send a shuttle down, get people to walk through? And of course, the poisonous atmosphere and everything is, causing a lot of problems. And I think McCoy has a great quote, something to the effect of, we have the power to destroy a planet, but yet we're absolutely helpless. So
right. It was one of those things where they were overpowered relative to the task that they wanted to accomplish.
Exactly. So it shows sort of the limitations of the power that they do have. So then there's another scene where Marta shows up. Kirk's sort of, wiped out from getting tortured. And Marta shows up and he's in bed. And of course, now you got to have the gratuitous, Kirk gets some play scene, right?
Yeah.
So Kirk's in bed and he's lying there and Marta shows up. And at first she's like all interested in him and stuff like that. Then all of a sudden she starts kissing him. And then while she kisses him, she pulls a knife on him. Then what happens is Spock walks in, or who we think is Spock. So Spock walks in and, stops Marta from killing Kirk, basically, and then gets to Kirk and says, okay, let's go to the control room. Let's get out of here or whatever. So they get there, and then they go through the same thing again about trying to give the code, right? Call up Scott, and say, okay, get a security detail down here and all this. And Kirk's like, well, hold on a second. Why is Spock like trying to get me to give the code to Scotty and what's going on here? And then finally, Kirk realizes it's not Spock, it's actually Garth, who then, reforms himself.
Yeah.
And, fight ensues. Well, Kirk tries to talk to him a little bit, and say, oh, remember what you were. You were a starship captain. You were great, whatever. And Garth is not having any of it, so it's not really, nothing's really getting through to him. So, another fight ensues and, Kirk then wakes up again. And this time they're going to have, Garth is deciding he's going to have a coronation scene. So then you have another extremely bizarre scene where you have all these inmates lined up while Garth, crowns himself sort of king of the universe. Anyway, so they have this coronation scene, which of course, goes terribly wrong, right? And, again, Kirk is like, I'm not going along with this. And so, again, he gets knocked out again. I don't know how many times Kirk gets knocked down in this particular episode, but he gets hit a few times. Anyway, next thing you know, he gets dragged back into the control room where Garth is like, okay, here's what I'm going to do. He's like, I held in my hand, it looks like a bottle of like multicolored glitter. He's like, I hold in my hand the most powerful explosive ever invented. Kirk was warned by Corey. He's like, when this guy says he invents something, he really actually does invent it. So, that's probably dangerous, explosive. Anyway, he says he's going to, expose Marta out to the surface and then blow her up for no good reason. So this was his, lover, paramour, whatever. And now he's just going to have her blown up for no good reason. Again, I think this is an example of somewhat gratuitous violence that didn't drive the plot. And maybe it was not so great for children, but heck, it's 1969, so they're going to throw it in there. And then basically you see the two guys and they've only showed up, if you remember in the original series, the space suits they had, very unusual looking. They didn't look like, they couldn't make them look like normal spacesuits like people were wearing back actually in 1969. So these huge, tall helmets, right?
Yeah.
And then they had this sort of red and blue sort of piping on the outside. And you see them in a couple of additional episodes where they have these unusual spacesuits. Anyway, so a couple guys drag her out in spacesuits and then run off. And, she's beginning to choke because of the poisonous atmosphere. And then Garth says he's just taken one tiny bit of this explosive and put it in her locket. And he blows her up.
Yeah. So. He says it's something like, on the scale of like a grain of sand or something.
Exactly. But it's such a powerful explosion
right.
that they register it up on the Enterprise. So on the Enterprise, they continue to try to do different things, and you actually see a phaser shot. So they take a phaser shot at one end of the planet, but it doesn't work. So it's really up to Kirk and Spock to sort of get out of there. Anyway, so Spock is now in the brig, and he's being guarded by, I believe it's an Andorian and a Tellarite. And, he sees these guys coming. He's like, all right, I'm going to play dead. Spock plays dead, and they sort of are dragging him out. And he does, the only time I've ever seen him do this, the double Vulcan neck pinch. So, it's interesting. They're dragging him out. He all of a sudden comes alive, boom, gets both of them at the same time. So I've never seen a lot of single neck pinches, but never a double Vulcan neck pinch. He walks into the control room, and all of a sudden, instead of seeing one Kirk, he sees two Kirks, right? So Garth has transformed himself into Kirk. And this is probably one of the first times ever in TV history that you have a double face-off. Now, it's interesting the way they do it, because initially, right, it's a split screen. So you can see, if you understand a little bit about special effects, how they're doing it, Kirk's being filmed in two spots in a split screen. But then, right, when they show him from the back, you can see the double is not exactly. So you're looking, before, back in the day when it was just TV and it went by in a second, you couldn't really see it. But now when you can stop it, right, you can actually see it. So, Spock says, well, here's the thing. He's like, one of you is Garth. Whoever is Garth is generating using immense amounts of energy in order to remain him. So I will just sort of sit here and wait for you to run out. And he said, I have nothing but time. Anyway, this, Garth as Kirk all of a sudden starts throwing punches. So now you have this huge, sort of fight where they go back and they go forth and they go back and they go forth. And you can't really tell, there are little instances, and I'll talk about it a little bit later, where you can see the actual double, right? So because they couldn't, they don't have CGI, so they couldn't put their face on another guy. So, the fight ensues, and then, they break up for a little bit. And a little bit more of a conversation with Spock. He's like, okay, I'm the captain. No, I'm the captain. And Garth as Kirk says, hey, do this. I'm your captain. I'm ordering you. And, Spock says, well, I maybe just should shoot one of you. And Kirk says, no, shoot both of us, and that way you'll be 100% sure. And that's when he realized that's actually Kirk, and he shoots Garth. That's the end of sort of that's the climax of the story. Next, Garth is being treated with this medication that Kirk and Spock were bringing to sort of treat them. And of course, when Garth wakes up, he's like completely normal. He's like, oh, I don't even remember anything that happened. So it's like, he's like, oh, who are you? And he's like, Captain Kirk and, all that kind of stuff. In the end, you have this nice little, sort of back and forth with Kirk and Spock where they talk about, how Spock figured it out. And, Kirk says, I doubt King Solomon would have agreed with the way you handled this. But, it's like a little Kirk and Spock bro time. And then we go right into the exit music. But anyway, very entertaining. I would call this, without question, a bottle episode. You know what I mean by that?
Kind of just self-contained, or?
Well, bottle episodes are a particular type of TV episode where a production is looking to limit costs. So you do that by limiting the set and limiting the number of actors with speaking roles on the set. So if you notice, the asylum looks suspiciously like certain parts of the Enterprise, right? The hallway and the rooms and stuff like that. And so basically they're just repurposing materials they already have. And also, so, they're not really visiting, walking around a planet or seeing buildings or stuff like that. And there's not a lot of space action in this. We just see the Enterprise circling a planet. And even on the Enterprise, the action is limited. They never leave the bridge. There's only 3 or 4 actors on the bridge. So it's very much a bottle episode. I think that's what someone would call it.
I think the original series had a few of those. I think of Cat's Paw, there was the one where they're just kind of in this black, basically a theater space.
Exactly. Yeah. It's a way to control costs when production costs are getting too high. As we all know, entertainment's a business. You got a budget. You got to stick to it, right?
Fair enough. Yeah. All right. So for the Next Generation episode, for this episode of our podcast, The High Ground, Season 3, Episode 12 of The Next Generation, I'll just start by noting that based on the different run times of the series, this is, a little less than halfway through the Next Generation's series run, whereas same spot for the original series was kind of towards the end. But because they're similar kinds of within their season episodes, about midway through a traditional 25, 26 episode season, this air date was similar calendar year wise to Whom Gods Destroy, High Ground having dropped January 31st, 1990, which for me would have been about midway through the 3rd grade. And
I'm in college at the time.
So we start out with the Enterprise D in orbit above a non-affiliated planet, Rutia 4, so the 4th planet in the Rutia system. So this is something I didn't quite appreciate until coming back to rewatch this episode a little bit after seeing it air in real time so many years ago. But this planet is not part of the Federation, but it's not part of they're friendly and they have a friendly trade relationship, but they're not really part of the Federation, nor do I think that they're necessarily auditioning to become a part. There were other episodes, famously Code of Honor, where
we know how much you like Code of Honor.
I mention it every chance I get, like right now. But basically, this is a friendly but not quite Federation planet that the Enterprise D is in orbit above to make a routine, trade supplies, medical supplies, basically a supply run. And Dr. Beverly, another Dr. B, is on the surface of the planet, hanging out. It's looking nice. They're, getting their lunch on.
Yeah, they're actually she's sitting with Worf and they're having a meal at a cafe, basically.
Yeah. And we know how picky of an eater Worf can be. So it's curious to think about what he might have been chowing on this friendly but not quite Federation planet. So they're having lunch together and then suddenly this bomb goes off. There's, no real indication yet of exactly what's going on, but Dr. Beverly is, I'm a doctor, I've got to treat these people. Worf, help me improvise, get some alcoholic drinks to help me improvise sterile bandages. And right away, I'll just go out of my way to just point out that there's a meme or a trope throughout the Next Generation series of Worf either having decent or in many cases the right idea and being shut down by the other senior officers. So he's like, I don't know, doctor, this looks pretty dangerous. We should probably get out of here. She's like, no, I'm a doctor and I need to help. And I think it's at this point where, Data also jumps in to be like, well, this planet has its own doctors.
Yeah, everyone literally
none of them are here right now.
Everyone literally tells her, get out of there several times. They're like, get out of there. It's not going to end well. But she, continues to go forward.
Exactly. And on the ship's bridge, captain and Captain Picard, Commander Riker are both like, well, we should probably get her out of there. And she, I don't know if it's exactly subordination, but the captain advises her to beam up, and she's like, no.
Well, and what I find interesting is what happens on the bridge when the captain says, okay, you need to get out of there. And he goes to Riker and says, she needs to leave. And Riker's like, well, I don't want to be there in the transporter room when she shows up. Yeah. So he's like afraid of her. I don't know what the story is there. I mean, you're right. She's lower in rank, but he's like, I'm not going to tell her that. I mean, you tell her that.
So you have all these people starting with Worf telling her to get out of there. And she's like, no. And then, of course, the quote unquote bad guys, I'm going to put it in quotes for now because this is, I think, a theme of this episode where you start out, or at least I started out rooting for the, I guess, main Rudians or the Rutian
the government we'll call them.
the governing the Rudian government.
We could use the
governing
words.
Rutians.
Governments and insurgents or separatists.
Separatists. I don't know if Rutian nationalists makes sense because they don't quite explain the name, but there's some other part of the planet there's this other group of the native population that wants to separate and set up their own separate government.
Like one of the continents.
The Western continent. So they're also using this super duper not exactly transporter, but more like a dimensional shifting technology, which is undetectable until you get Crusher and them on the case later. So we'll come back to that. But basically they kidnap her, and the senior staff is meeting on the senior command conference room.
In that conference room they had.
Yeah. And one of my favorite lines is from early in the episode. I marked it down at around the 5:45 minute mark. Again, Worf turns out to be right at pretty much every turn in this episode. So when they're reconvening after the guys have kidnapped Crusher, Worf is like, I'm pretty sure that they targeted her specifically for kidnapping. And Riker's like, well, why would they want, what would they want with a Federation, citizen? We're not part of their conflict. And then Worf, without missing a beat, is like, we are now.
Exactly.
Or I think the exact quote is Riker is saying, why would they kidnap one of us? Their conflict doesn't concern us. And Worf is like, it does now. And again, that's setting up for later where the head guy in charge absolutely is trying to drag the Federation into this conflict. And he specifically targeted the Doctor for other reasons. But Worf is basically right, even though we don't quite know it yet. So once she's in the Separatist compound, it's basically, again, these are details I didn't quite appreciate, but in my original viewings as like an 8.5-year-old, but they're basically in this entirely closed cavern on a little bit below the planet's surface, to where there's no entrances. So you're only able to access it via some sort of transporter-like technology.
Exactly. It's a cavern that's been glammed up a bit with some technology and some steel walls and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And, some trusses and things. So
yeah, and the important thing too is that I think with the next generation, especially, there has emerged this meme over the years of like the tech of the week, or TOW, kind of like monster of the week for other series like Buffy or things like that. So this tech of the week is an interdimensional shifting technology that is undetectable again until Crusher and the team get on it, until Wesley Crusher and the team get on it.
Exactly.
Put some respect on his name. And the compound is shielded as well. So initially the Enterprise crew has no way of, tracking where Dr. Crusher has been taken to. I've got to say that aside from the Separatist leader, the other main guest star in this episode, Carrie Keene. I liked her a lot. Alexana Devos. She is the main head of security on this planet. So again, the way that the episode went for me was I found myself identifying with her very early, because it's like, oh, too bad they stole your beloved ship's doctor. We're dealing with this kind of stuff all the time. Let's get together and work this out and find this poor innocent lady who's so beloved and so valuable to you and your team, and we have to deal with this all the time. And then, throughout the episode, she's kind of it's funny as a juxtaposition. So during the episode, when Dr. Crusher is in captivity, you can see Finn is Kirill Finn is the name of the separatist leader. You can see him kind of trying to work her and using combinations of fear and sympathy to try to, win her favor. Initially in her captivity, she is just doing kind of the basic medical ethics in terms of there are separatists who are wounded and need medical attention. A big plot point of this episode is that the interdimensional shifting technology is also slowly killing the separatists who are using it. And so beyond just wanting a high-ranking Federation officer, Kirill Finn's other reason for abducting Dr. Crusher specifically was that they needed medical help, and they needed someone to see if there was a way to reverse this. I think it's a DNA degeneration
DNA damage
that the dimensional shifting is doing over time. So she's initially helping out in terms of general medical ethics, even though everyone else is kind of part of this group that's kidnapped her. They are in need of medical care. She's limited, of course, in terms of what she can do because she's not on the Enterprise. Meanwhile, I thought it was very, very touching to have Captain Picard working with Wesley Crusher to, rescue his mom / his friend.
I mean, you see Picard as the father figure to Wesley, and, they have this conversation with Deanna Troi and Picard and Wesley, and, they'll worry about his feelings and stuff like that. But Picard says the best way to get his mind off of things is to get him to work. So get him down engineering with Geordi, with Data,
the whole crew,
help him engage his mind, come up with a solution, which makes a lot of sense. And he actually does, contribute to the actual solution that helps figure this thing out.
And it was also sweet, just from my perspective, to see, Wesley was like, oh, I want to go down and fight these guys. And Picard's like, no,
we got this.
Well, and in terms of who better on the ship to figure out just where to look and how to find her than you. And so that's also another common, I don't know if triptych is the right word, but a common recurrence throughout The Next Generation is some combination of Geordi, Data, and Wesley before he goes off to the academy, working together on sciencey things.
They're the science geniuses, and
Yeah, so that's always just nice to see. So at a certain point, the separatists figure out a way to get onto the Enterprise, and they're, Kirill Finn is telegraphing this to Dr. Crusher while she's in captivity. Hey, I'm going to have to maybe take out your ship in order to advance my political goals and drag the Federation into this thing some more. So they use their dimensional shifting to get onto the ship and try to plant a bomb, or do actually technically plant a bomb on the warp core.
And again, a bit of gratuitous violence, because they kill a number of people when they go onto that ship. So the initial scene is it's a red shirt, of course, and a blue shirt walking down the hallway. The terrorist or insurgent shows up and immediately shoots the red shirt guy. Then one jumps onto the engineering deck and starts just shooting people up. And Geordi basically jumps out of the way at the last minute. But I mean, it's very violent. Then they jump onto the bridge and start shooting. Worf gets hit.
Yeah.
I mean, this is just, it was sort of from the new generation perspective, sort of a bloodbath, to have all those people killed like that.
Yeah. And then again, after doing all of that, when their bomb doesn't work, when Geordi comes through at the last minute, showing up super clutch, he's able to detach the bomb from the warp core and beam it into space.
Well, what he does is interesting because he detaches the bomb, he puts his communicator onto the bomb and says, beam it on my signal.
Right.
And what's interesting there, as I noticed that when he said that, Deanna Troi jumps out of her seat. She says, on his signal. Yeah. It's like, what's going on there? I don't know what
and
the
then Picard kind of like waves her off. He's like, no, I got
Picard seems to know what he's doing. And then, he just, beams it outside the ship, and that's the end of that.
Right. But then in order to press their, agenda and, kind of as a plan B, they come back and, start shooting more people, take Picard next.
Yes.
And when Picard gets, to catching up with Dr. B, he's like, I saw Worf go down. I don't quite know what his status is. Yes, Wesley was there, but I didn't see, what happened to him. Even from that point, by now, Dr. Crusher is like starting to kind of see things their way. There's the line where she's starting to defend these guys after Picard has already told her like what's gone down, and Captain Picard is like, well, I don't have to tell you, Dr. Crusher, about the psychological effects of like long term.
He accuses her of having Stockholm syndrome.
Yeah,
he basically says, you're coming down with Stockholm syndrome.
Which I did a little bit of research on, just not official Dr. B research, but it's interesting. Stockholm syndrome is still more of a theory than like a set thing. Mm-hmm. And because those kinds of kidnappings are relatively rare, there just isn't a lot of data, lowercase d, on how prevalent that is and exactly, when it's likely to come about and who's likely to have it and why. But
it makes a convenient plot point for movies and television.
Yes. And so, then you've got Picard directly confronting Kirill Finn and saying, we're not going to help you. And by the way, you kidnap people and shoot them from the shadows and all of this stuff. But going back to the Enterprise crew, Wesley, Crusher, Geordi, and them have like cracked the case. And with repeated uses of this technology, they've like managed to figure it out. And figure out where, that the compound is this this cave basically that doesn't have any surface entrances. So they have to, figure out how to get down there. Once they do, they're kind of generally on this rescue mission, except the routine security chief, Alexana, has her own mission. So the episode kind of ends with, I don't know if you'd call it an assassination plot, but she takes out Kirill Finn from behind without, him having an opportunity to face her or face off against her. Interesting that in that moment, Dr. Crusher is able to see what's happening, and you can kind of see a little bit of doubt and should I warn him? But she lets it go down. And Alexana has her own justification, saying that if she, had let him live, then he would have been more dangerous as a prisoner and would have caused more bloodshed and more conflict, going the traditional criminal justice route. And then you have the I guess, A boy. Because there were a few younger kids throughout the
but there's one that they focus
episode,
on,
right? Who's about to counter revenge on Alexana and the Enterprise crew, and I don't exactly know how to say it, but Crusher's Dr. Crusher is basically like no more killing, right? It's like very reminiscent of the in real life 1990s anti-violence campaigns, like squash it or all Glocks down.
And I think the scene with the boy was making the point that this, sort of, cause has been passed on to a new generation.
Yeah.
And when I think about that time, 1990, of course we knew what terrorism was, but this is 10 years or 11 years before 9/11, right?
Yeah.
It was not something at the time that you associated with the United States. We didn't even have the domestic terrorism that you would have beginning in 1995 with the Oklahoma City bombing.
And the first World Trade Center
bombing, which was, in
with the van.
the 92, 93, I can't remember. But so it was terrorism was something that was for Americans at the time was at a remove from us, but it was something. It was more like what was happening with the Federation being pulled in. It was more like as America we thought we'd be pulled into situations in the Middle East or in Northern Ireland, where which were the hot spots of sort of violence around political games and political goals. But that's sort of, what becomes the theme of the discussion in this episode is to what extent can violence be used or should violence be used to attain political goals? And of course, that's extremely controversial, and that's one of the reasons why this episode was banned.
The time frame is always useful to remember. So thank you for pointing that. This was
early 1990, so the Cold War was ending, not ended yet, because Gorbachev was still in power. The Cold War was ending, and everyone was actually feeling pretty good about everything, if I remember back then.
So good historical notes. So I do remember Berlin Wall, October 89.
That was in fall of 89.
Yeah, so this would have been 3 months later.
The Berlin Wall came down, and the Eastern European countries were beginning to shift over. But Russia was still very much Russia at the time. And so we weren't yet out of the sort of Cold War mentality. Not to mention, around that time, you had Tiananmen Square. So China was sort of cracking down. So, but again, that links with the whole issue of, political goals, protest, insurgency. That was still very much on people's minds back then, although it was not as much a domestic concern as it would become within the next decade.
So again, we have the episode more or less wrapping up with Dr. Crusher and her "Stop the Violence" message, which again was very much of that point in the early 90s as well. I want to say the anti-violence campaigns in general, especially among for youths and juvenile population. So yeah, that was pretty much that episode. I will say that it hadn't been one of the episodes that I would come back to more before now, but having rewatched it, a little bit, can kind of appreciate more things now than I used to. So
yeah, it's an interesting episode where there's a lot of discussion about ideas, right? And so you have, for the techie guys, you got a little bit of a solve a science problem, right? And then for others who are more interested in the more sort of general themes, you have a discussion about this issue of, using violence for political goals. And what's interesting is this was written by Melissa Snodgrass, who had wrote a few episodes, but also has a very strong history background and is a lawyer. So she brought a lot of that kind of language into this particular episode. But that would cause problems for this episode in certain circumstances. But we'll talk about that in a second. Interesting concepts. Okay, so let's talk about these two episodes and compare them. So plot points and tropes. You have various Star Trek tropes. One of the ones that I always find interesting is when they're trying to talk about make a particular point, and they'll cite several people in history that actually existed, and then two people that you've never heard of.
Yeah.
So at one point, Garth is like, well, I'm going to be so great, I'm going to be as big as Alexander the Great and Napoleon. And then he calls out Lee Kwan and Crotus. So I was like, who are Lee Kwan and Crotus? So Lee Kwan was sort of like Khan from Wrath of Khan. He was in that era.
Okay.
Late 20th century, 1990s in the Star Trek world. And he was in Asia. And they don't say much about him, but he was sort of on the level of Khan and sort of, historical importance. Crotus is actually one of the great historical figures of Andoria. Okay. So he was an Andorian. And so, everyone knows.
It's been nice for that Andorian who was present to feel included.
The Andorian who was wearing the, I don't know what that you'd call that red shawl. Yeah. Very interesting wardrobe. We'll talk about that when we get to wardrobe. So, that was one of those, tropes that you often see. Again, the sort of violence, I got into a conversation with someone at a Star Trek convention about how we were kids when we were watching this stuff, 5, 6, 7-year-old in the early 1970s, we weren't being monitored in the same way that I think, children are monitored when we watch TV. No one cared. I mean, they were off doing their own stuff. And, we would see these violent things, some of which were rather disturbing, Now, what's interesting is that when Star Trek would be shown in syndication, particularly in other countries, they would catch some of these things. And that would cause problems for some of these episodes, particularly this episode, which is one of the reasons that it was banned in the United Kingdom. So
things like blowing up a woman.
Exactly. But, back in 1976, yeah, 1976, when I was watching this, I mean, no one was watching me watching this. So I just saw this and I was like, oh, 7 years old watching this type of stuff. But there's an argument that, hey, is it really that necessary?
Even just the advent of, I'm going to say lowercase c censorship. So I remember when the TV ratings came on board, right? So something like, most original series episodes would probably be something like TV, 7 or something like that, or TV PG. This episode might have been, again, you're blowing people up and your mental illness and threats of bombs. And I don't know that it would have been TVMA, but it would have, I'm just thinking about how the modern, TV ratings would have applied to this episode.
You did have those ratings, and I think everyone understood that The Next Generation was a little bit more of an adult show with a little bit more of adult themes. I mean, in the 70s, when people talked about Star Trek, that was sort of kiddie stuff. I don't think it was kiddie stuff when they started running it in the 60s, but by the time it was on syndicated TV, it was like, who's watching this? Kids and people that are, maybe not working. So, it was a very different audience from when it was running in prime time, when there was very little on TV. And I think it was for a small group a growing group of science fiction fans, more like adult viewing. But that eventually became something that would be more family viewing or even kids viewing it. For me, it was the only people that watched Star Trek in the house were the children. I couldn't really get my parents interested in that. So, the other thing, let's see. I mean, looking at the tropes, what do you think were some of the tropes of the high ground?
I think is, again, as I was saying from before, you kind of have these quote unquote good guys and bad guys. And then over the course of the episode, they switch a little bit. There were the themes of medical ethics. So Dr. Crusher, even though she's, not obligated to the planet in general, she's a visitor. She's still a doctor first. And if people need treatment, even at the risk of her own safety, she's going to do that. I looked it up, and the High Ground would have aired about 20 years after. Let me see if I can get the French right. Médecins Sans Frontières, right? Doctors Without Borders, came into existence around 71, I want to say. So they'd been around for a while when the High Ground aired. And even, on an ongoing basis, when there are conflicts around the world, Doctors Without Borders is there, providing care, again, often in places where they also have doctors already, but for whatever reason, they're overwhelmed or, not able to meet the need of medical treatment in these conflict areas. So I was thinking about that a lot during the High Ground episode, just Dr. Crusher's medical ethics, treating people wherever they may be and wherever she may be, even if she's being held captive.
And it goes to the broader theme of The Next Generation of having an ethical lesson within the episode, right? So they're entertaining, but at the same time, they're trying to sort of make a point, right? Particularly about how in a future world we can maybe think more effectively about these things or think about these things in a more of a sort of higher level of ethics and things like that.
Right. It was fun to see Data asking Picard all these questions, and Data knows all of the semantic. He knows the facts. No pun intended. He has the data, but he's kind of unintentionally stumping Picard with all of his questions about, so violence is an effective tool in many cases for achieving political ends.
And that's what got this episode in trouble. So now you've raised it, and now we're going to discuss it.
Yeah. So
this episode was banned in the United Kingdom. And it was banned because of one particular line that Data utters. So in that exchange between Data and Picard, they're talking about the use of violence to obtain political goals. And Data gives a number of examples that one that was actually occurred, the independence of the Mexican state from Spain, and one that would have been in the future at the time, the Irish unification of 2024 and the Kenzie Rebellion. Well, the Irish unification of 2024, which for you listeners is the year we're actually recording this. This is April of 2024. You can imagine how that didn't go over too well with the BBC. So someone at the BBC decided that this particular episode was not going to be shown in its entirety. So there's an article that I'm looking at from the BBC News that discusses that this episode was banned both by the BBC and by Ireland, although when they're looking for the actual letter that banned it, no one can seem to find anything. And in fact, someone says, well, this decision was probably made at the lower levels, but we don't really have a record for why this was banned.
Curious.
And my understanding is that only recently has it been shown. So now what's interesting is that our other episode, Whom the Gods Destroy, was also banned, but for completely different reasons. And that was banned because, again, sort of the gratuitous violence. And I actually have the letter here where the British Broadcasting Corporation bans those episodes. And someone had written in 17 February 1984 saying, I want to see these Star Trek episodes and I can't. Why can't I? And they write back, thank you for your letter. And the BBC has indeed reacquired the rights to show the series Star Trek. However, there were no plans to screen the 4 episodes Empath, Whom the Gods Destroy, Plato's Stepchildren, and Miri. This is because we feel that they deal most unpleasantly with the already unpleasant subjects of madness, torture, sadism, and disease. You will appreciate that account must be taken that out of Star Trek's large and enthusiastic following, many are juveniles, the issue we were just talking about before, who would watch the program no matter what time of day the series is put into the program schedules. So what was not being done in the United States, at least in my time, at least the BBC was keeping an eye on this and saying, you know what, these particular episodes, we think that there's some issues there, so we're not going to show them.
Interesting. Miri. Because Miri is one of the episodes I do actually remember seeing multiple times as a child myself from the original series. So it's funny to me that was.
Yeah. I don't know how they decided on those, but, they were banned and now they're not banned. I mean, basically what happened is over time, VCR, streaming, and you just can't really ban anything like that now. But back in the day when, these were being shown on BBC, in the UK, when you had 1, 2, or 3 channels, you could ban them.
Plato's Stepchildren one of the?
Yes.
Help me out here. Is that the first interracial kiss episode?
I believe it may be, yes. But I don't think that's why they banned it.
Yeah, just throwing it out there.
Yeah. Subjects of madness, torture. I think that's one of the reasons in Plato's Stepchildren. Sadism. That's a bit over the top. I don't know if there's any sadism in Star Trek, the original series, but.
Well, I mean, definitely.
Maybe I missed it.
I'll put on my lowercase Dr. B hat. Whom Gods Destroy, right? Like that. It takes. I know that by the end of the episode, they cure him, and my rewatching, I'm wondering, was it the accident that made Garth quote unquote insane, or was it the cellular reorganization that made him quote insane, before he appears in the episode? But the kind of stuff that he's doing where, you take an intimate partner and you blow her up just to show people that you're not joking around. I could imagine something like that, even though I guess by today's standards, relatively tame. But something like that might technically be an example of sadism only to the extent that if you're going by the book, in terms of various psychiatry texts and manuals, that, to derive pleasure from someone else's suffering, particularly certain kinds of pleasure from someone else's suffering, would kind of be more in the sadistic ballpark. But yes. Interesting just to note, from what you found, especially since I think of BBC, I think of BBC America, and even today, last time I checked, they continue to rebroadcast at least Next Generation episodes on a semi-regular basis. Oh,
Star Trek is very popular in the United Kingdom, and nowadays I don't think they have any of these restrictions. But back in the time, the United Kingdom is known for having a very different censorship regime than the United States because they don't have a First Amendment. So, the broadcasters, at least the BBC, when it was the primary or sole broadcaster, had much more leeway on what they wanted to show and what they couldn't. And there's a whole list of films that you have in the United States and movies, other types of entertainment plays that were not shown in the United Kingdom. Now it's sort of more evened out because we have more of a global culture. But back in the time, the United Kingdom was known for a bit of a regime of censorship, particularly in the 50s and the 60s.
Interesting. I've got to say that in terms of Whom Gods Destroy, the dancing, I'm surprised that the dance routine didn't draw more.
It may have factored in. Let's talk about the acting in these two episodes. Again, Shatner, that doesn't hold back. He's not afraid to get into the scenery and chew it up. And he does that in this episode.
Yeah. To me, and we talked about this a little bit earlier with the Steve Ilnot. Mm-hmm. This is one episode in which, to me, Shatner isn't the most dramatic of the actors. So just that by itself is fun. Where this guest star is, even more dramatic. And again, how they have to team up with their scenes and with their, acting and emotions to pull off these transitions.
The character that they're portraying, and I think that's also for Nimoy. He's having to do that because he switches into the other character. He's impersonated by Garth. And then also the sort of what I'll call the face-off when the two doubles sort of go at each other. That's very interesting sort of acting. It's different. It's more sort of physical acting. But, again, Shatner's having to do that. Now, I will note that, and again, I'm not picking on the technology of the time, but you can see the double 45 minutes and 44 seconds and 45 minutes and 52 seconds. So if our viewers want to watch it to actually see the double, you can see it there. But ultimately, I think that they handled that very well, the way they covered the whole double thing. And it came across great. It's like, okay, these guys look exactly alike. So
yeah, I was really impressed by to me, one of the unique elements of Whom Gods Destroy is that in a lot of cases, Captain Kirk is trying to make some point to some race to, stop killing each other or stop killing other people. Or there's the, I'm not sure if Annihilation Now, the episode where they're doing computer games, but actually sending people to die. Yeah. And, he's making these appeals to people's, morality and their unique histories of their planets, or using Earth as an example in our future history as of the 23rd century. In this, he's, I don't like this kind of terminology, but he's trying to reason with a madman. And also like a whole cast and crew of other, people who are also mentally ill for whatever reason. And that really jumped out at me as one unique element of Shatner and his acting in this episode, is that compared to other situations that Kirk finds himself in, he's trying to appeal to people who by definition don't exactly have reason. So that was fun for me to watch on screen.
Yes. Now, when we talk about the production design, I sort of consider this to be sort of late Star Trek, post 1968 production design, which was a little bit different than the earlier seasons. I think in this last season, they really, there was a lot going on in 1968. You had the Summer of Love, and you had all the
three assassinations
and this whole concept the country was just coming apart at the seams. And so, that was somewhat reflected in the sort of production design. And then you had all this this color are everywhere, So, in fact, as a child, the one thing I remember about the 70s, I don't remember the late 60s that much because I was born at the end of it, but definitely the 1970s, was all the different sort of color that you had. I mean, people wore much more expressive, colorful patterns. There wasn't as much monochrome. Very rarely would people wear an earth tone. And you see that in this episode, sort of all the different color, as we talked about the candy colored food, the beads, the purple, I noticed that they had one of those speckled linoleum floors in one of the episodes, but, the geodesic mirror, the use of glitter, the use of color, but you had a lot of color. Compare that to the Next Generation series episode where everything sort of begins to be monochrome.
Yeah.
So everyone, like in Rudia, everyone was sort of dressed in blue. Which
I thought was, I may be reading too much into this, but in terms of the production and wardrobe for the High Ground, I'm wondering if that was a deliberate choice, perhaps, because most of the walls, as opposed to Whom Gods Destroy, where there's a lot of green going on, in the High Ground, the opening shots are like the walls and the city walls and the buildings are literally shades of gray. and then you've got Crusher and the DeVos, right? Alexana DeVos, the chief security woman, who are two redheads wearing blue. And then Kirill Finn is not a redhead, but he's also wearing blue. Like they're all kind of in the same.
It's interesting. Again, it was one of those episodes where they didn't want to spend too much on alien makeup. So how do you make the people, the Rudians, look like they're an alien species? They only had one shock of thing in their
gray hair. Yeah,
gray hair for the men and red hair for the women. So again, saving a little bit of money here and there.
Yeah.
The other thing I noticed is they use this in a number of different episodes when they go to a alien planet, what I call the town square set. So it's a set that looks sort of like a town square with sort of cafes on the side and people walking through it. And you'll see that in a number of the Next Generation episodes. And this one looks sort of like a California mall where they put plants and stuff everywhere. They didn't even try to make it look like alien plants. They look like regular, looks like a California mall. But again, the monochrome, they're trying to give it a futuristic type feel. But if you notice, there's a number of different episodes where they start with that type of set. And that's because it's not outside. It's probably in a soundstage. Yeah. And it's, something that's very easy for them to just retrofit over and over and over again.
Yeah, definitely. In terms of the acting for the High Ground, I've got to say that, again, both of these episodes have great guest actors and guest actresses. Richard Cox, yes. Just from the first scene he's in, he's not quite chewing the scenery in kind of that, that haughty, not a narcissistic way that you get with the Whom Gods Destroy and that character, but he's just really mean and just
he's a rather accomplished actor. I have his Wikipedia. He performed on Broadway with Ingrid Bergman. He appeared with Al Pacino in Cruising, a number of different shows, including Sanford and Son, and then Beretta. Pretty much very well employed throughout the 1980s and early 1990s in a number of shows that we all remember. Murder, She Wrote, Simon and Simon, Magnum PI. These are the shows I grew up with. Anyway, I think he did a great job as sort of a guest actor for Star Trek and very memorable. And, he had to sort of carry that particular episode. So I thought he did an excellent job with the acting. Yeah. But all in all, the acting on The Next Generation, it's, everyone knows their character by this point in time, three episodes in. And so there's not a lot of variation. Worf's being Worf, Picard's being Picard, Beverly Crusher's being Beverly Crusher, and, Riker's being Riker. And there's just a lot of, but there's, The Next Generation is much more of an ensemble, right? So everyone's sort of getting their say. Deanna Troi, everyone has their role. In the original series is pretty much just Kirk and everyone sort of reacting to Kirk in one way or another, except for Nimoy, who sort of comes up to the level. But, it's Kirk's show. There's no question about it. And people give Shatner a hard time. Oh, he's grandstanding. He had to carry that show. No one else is carrying that show except for Shatner. He was in almost every single scene, right? So, it was sort of, people were sort of reacting to him. So.
Yeah. One thing that jumped out at me, speaking of that, is that both by, I suppose, the casting and the writing, if it's more of an ensemble, then in the high ground, Captain Picard has the benefit of Counselor Troi and like her literally her counsel in terms of how to deal, how to support Wesley and carry out the mission. Whereas just in terms of the setup in the original series, Captain Kirk basically has himself. Sometimes someone like, Dr. McCoy will kind of be more of a voice of humanity or of humanism or something like that. But with Picard, he's got all these other resources amongst the people that he can draw upon. And
who help and assist.
Right, and play different roles.
So why don't we talk for a second about the music? And one thing that I notice is that the original series and The Next Generation uses music in different ways. So in the original series, you have this orchestration, and it sort of pops up when different things are happening. So, of course, everyone remembers the original series fight music, dun, 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 and then, of course, you have sort of the memory music. So in that one moment where Kirk is talking to Garth about his past as a captain, you hear that sort of faint horns going off and everything. And then sometimes they'll bring in an oboe sort of, to sort of underscore something very serious being discussed. Now, what's interesting, and I read up a little bit about this, before the 1970s, you could do what was called tracking for these different episodes. So basically in the 70s, the union rules changed. So for The Next Generation, they had to record new soundtracks for all of these different episodes. Whereas for the original series, they were reusing different tracks, right? So they were just saying, okay, well, this is going to happen now. Let's bring in the music here. That's going to happen now. Bring in the music here. So, but because with the original series, you're so keyed into the musical themes, the music really gives you a sense of what's going on. And if you watch enough original series, you can tell what's going to happen by the music pretty much because it's the same sort of all the way through.
So in The Next Generation, anytime that there's a sound effect in a given episode,
it's recorded again. Now it could be the same, right? It's not written again, so it might be. But they had to record it. Union rules required that they get back in the studios, and The Next Generation used a lot more sort of
like
synthesizers and stuff like that. They did use some orchestration, but the original series was very, very classical, and you could clearly hear the instruments. You could hear the oboe, you could hear the French horn, you can hear the trumpets. In the Next Generation, sort of like, you got the synth going and all that kind of stuff. You can't really hear the instruments as well.
Well, I'm wondering then, so that's interesting with the music. I'll coming back to Marta's dance in in Whom Gods Destroy, I was getting, and there was even the joke in that episode about King Solomon, but to go to different king. I grew up watching movies like King of Kings and The Greatest Story Ever Told, and those sorts of movies. I want to say that King of Kings had Jeffrey Hunter in it, right? And the old joke from Family Guy that he was, good enough to play, our Lord and Savior, but was somehow not up for romancing strange green women, having been the original, Captain Pike. So the dance in particular reminded me of Salome, right? From and the music to go along with that. I'm not 100% sure, but it just gave me vibes of those movies where that
the sort of the drums and the bongos, and again, they're trying to express back at that time that meant exoticism, right? Belly dance. I call it belly dancing music.
Even the dance of the veils and the Ten Commandments. Also paramount. And
it conveys that it's alluring, and, the woman's alluring, and it's, supposed to convey this sort of sensualism and things like that. And that's, I did notice that sort of, the composer was someone named Fred Steiner, who was a veteran composer. Perry Mason, The Rocky and Bullwinkle Show. Rocky and Bullwinkle, extremely popular cartoon in my time. And then he did quite a few Star Trek episodes. So a lot of the music that, we hear in, Star Trek episodes like the Carbonite Maneuver, Balance of Terror, orchestrated by him. And again, very memorable, very timeless. When I'm listening to the music of Star Trek, I don't feel like I'm listening to the music from a 1960s series. It could be any sort of time, right? Where I listen to the music from the Next Generation, I know I'm listening to the 90s, right? I'm hearing that synth. And they use less music in The Next Generation, but they use it to underline certain types of things. But the music dates The Next Generation, I think, a little bit more than it dates the original series. If you want my opinion, now, listeners, you can question me on that. I'm happy to. I think to hear feedback. So
it's funny in general when I think of The Next Generation in music, I think of the opening theme.
Which is the opening theme from the motion picture,
right? Which
was reused over and over again,
right? And then the dun dun dun, when certain dramatic effects, and I guess the famous two-parter, The Best of Both Worlds, had the this is the Borg, or we have engaged the Borg, or where they use kind of unique soundtrack for the Borg and for that two-parter.
So going on next to sort of our comparison of Kirk versus Picard, I would say in both episodes, Kirk is Kirk, Picard is Picard. They do the stuff that they usually do. Kirk gets to have, some fooling around with someone who's green colored, and Picard, postulates quite a bit and, gets to make a few speeches, although they both get to throw a punch. Fighting on, which you rarely see Picard throwing a punch, but he does in this episode.
And I liked it so much, I marked it down around the 30 minute, the 29 and a half minute mark. We've got Picard throwing hands, which is fun to see. And it's also part of how he gets captured, but I was surprised in that scene that Data seemed kind of passive just in terms of fighting. It was at the point where they had disabled his con, but you don't really see him mixing it up just in that one particular fight scene. But it was fun to see Picard in the mix.
To see him throwing a punch. Yeah, Data sort of froze, but Data was sitting down. I think that's why he would have had to have gotten up. And the action is very quick.
That's fair enough. Just some backstory for Picard and his penchant for as I like to say, throwing hands. The classic episode from The Next Generation Tapestry goes into a lot of his background as a younger cadet and, in Starfleet Academy.
Yes.
And won't spoil it for now, but there's a whole story as to how he gets into this fight and gets severely injured as a result, and that helps him to become the man and the captain that he is in the present series that we know him as. Fun backstory. Q. It's a fun episode.
Now, you had mentioned Data. So speaking of Data, and, one of the things we want to do in this podcast is sort of run a comparison of Data v. Spock versus Spock, because they're very similar characters in some ways. It's interesting to compare the two. They're both logic driven, although one is an artificial life form and one is not. Although I know some Data fans might have an issue with me calling Data an artificial life form.
Which part, the artificial or the life form?
Yeah, exactly. I think, what's interesting here is that, Spock in the original series has a particular role not only as sort of the voice of logic, but also and as the problem solver. So I think it's similar that both Data and Spock are problem solvers. But Spock is not only the voice of logic, but he also plays an important role as a foil to Kirk, right? So a lot of Kirk's back and forth is reflecting off of Spock. So he plays a particular role. And there's also the role of the camaraderie and the relationship between those two,
right?
Which is a very important element of the original series. Whereas,
brotherhood, yeah.
And there is a connection emotionally of a sort between Data and Picard, but it's very clear that Data is subordinate to Picard in a way that, Spock is still subordinate to Kirk, but there's still, a certain level of camaraderie and equality between the two of them.
Yeah, it's interesting. So in Whom Gods Destroy, one of the things that jumped out at me with Mr. Spock, he seemed a bit more passive than usual compared to other episodes that he's in, maybe just by the necessity where it's really, Kirk and Garth facing off. But then he also, has some hot lines, right? At the very end, Captain Kirk, I presume.
Yes, Captain Kirk, I presume. Yeah, that was
that's hilarious.
A nice little, yeah. So the writers were having fun with the whole thing.
Just straight delivery. That was,
and Nimoy was always great with the deadpan sort of, they both have a deadpan, but in very different ways. Spiner, of course, is portraying a machine, so his cadence is a little bit different. And Spock is still, he's a person, but he is driven by logic. So you hear sort of the way he's thinking and in the way he comes through.
Yeah. Speaking of which, Spock is great, but one thing I was thinking of for Whom Gods Destroy, if it had been Data in there, he can probably tell them apart. Like Spock has to apply logic, and
Data has other tools. I don't know, infrared eyes. I don't know all the stuff that Data has, but he has logic.
So one thing that Data has that they come back to a few times in the Next Generation is he can basically imitate Picard's voice perfectly.
Yep.
So for the Data lore episode, maybe the one where his creator has him track him down to, say goodbye to him. He does all this unethical stuff that he normally wouldn't do, including imitating Picard's voice to trick the ship's computer. So if he can imitate Picard's voice perfectly, he can probably tell apart, someone like Garth from actual Kirk.
In each of these episodes, any hot moments for you?
Just going to keep saying Marta's dance. And bringing it back to Garth a bit, in the Whom Gods Destroy episode, there was early-ish in the episode, this moment where he says, fascinating, kind of like how Spock does. And I thought that was funny, where either by design or by accident, he's kind of, mimicking Spock.
Yeah.
That was one of my fun moments from that episode.
One thing that I noticed was that there was almost a love confession from when they think they're about to be killed, or that Picard's about to be killed. Beverly Crusher almost, confesses, which almost happened several times, where they almost...
The classic will they or won't they?
Well, exactly, yeah. So, in conclusion, I just want to have a little bit more of a discussion of the history surrounding these two particular episodes. Again, the 1960s, I think you have this issue of the society having a lot of different stresses and strains. And, there was a lot of sort of acting in different ways and cultural norms being subverted in the 1960s. And that was reflected in the culture. And a part of the idea of the various colors and things like that is that, instead of just the gray flannel suit of the 1950s, we're going to wear all these expressive colors and things like that. One of the things that was interesting about the 1960s is that this was during the period where they were trying to sell more color TV sets. So for a show like Star Trek, to be able to have a lot of color was very important. From Wikipedia, I found out that as late as 1964, only 3.1% of households in the U.S. had a color TV set. And all three networks didn't start airing full color primetime schedules until the 1966-67 broadcast season.
Which is Star Trek's debut season.
Yeah. And, the number of color television sets sold in the United States did not exceed black and white sales until 1972. I'm just old enough to remember TV shows, which before the TV show would say shown in color, because that was a sort of advantage for these TV shows, right? Because instead of just watching black and white. So Star Trek was also involved in sort of the commercialization of this by having all this great color, which we now see, in our TV sets now, it really pops out. But, back in the day, having those strong colors were important for those early black and white TV sets, which didn't have quite the resolution we have now.
Interesting.
Early color TV sets.
Interesting historical note, Mr. G. That makes me think of the OG production company for Star Trek, Desilu.
Yes.
Many Star Trek fandom will cite and credit Lucille Ball as the mother of Star Trek, having been instrumental in getting it onto the air and keeping it onto the air. It's funny just to recall that she herself, iconic role in a black and white television show. Yeah,
a black and white television show, which I think was almost all black and white. I don't think it really ever, show, I don't know if I've ever quite seen that color. Maybe not, maybe at the very end.
There's like ways to go back and recolorize things that I think they've done here and there. But
Lucille Ball and her husband, of course, as you mentioned, owned the production company that was showing, where Star Trek was produced. And in fact, to save money, she would actually sweep the sets rather than have someone pay to do it.
Right.
Think about a star doing that right now, Angelina Jolie or Brad Pitt, sort of sweeping their own set floors. I mean, maybe they do it. Maybe I'll hear about it, but I'd be surprised. So, the 1960s were an era like no other in some ways. And you see that in sort of the Star Trek. But then, also at that same time, we had a space race, we had a Cold War, and all those things are sort of reflected, who are the good guys, who are the bad guys. It was very clear back then. Contrast that to the early 1990s, where things were beginning to get a little bit fuzzier, right? Who are the bad guys, who are the good guys? Well, you can have a discussion about that. And again, an era of tremendous change, I would say transformative, moving from an era that we thought we understood, where we had the Cold War, to an era that was coming up where, you didn't have this sort of, us and them, the Russians and the U.S., and there was some détente between Russia and the United States, and, the sort of Iron Curtain was falling. But then you had new sort of threats popping up, in different areas in the Middle East and others that would eventually become sort of more hotspots.
Yeah.
So very much, you saw that particular world transforming somewhat into the one that we live in now.
Famously, in the final of the exclusive original series movies, Undiscovered Country, you've got the beginnings of the Federation Klingon alliance. So also from around not too long after, trying to place the exact dates, but maybe a couple years after the High Ground episode that, from The Next Generation, 92 or something like that. In terms of the Star Trek 6, The Undiscovered Country.
Yes, that was around that time period. Yeah, The Undiscovered Country, I believe, was 93 or 94.
Okay.
The fans will correct me on that.
But yes, interesting of you to point out the advancements in television broadcasting and television set technology, and we didn't exactly have that with the run of the Next Generation. The closest thing I can think of is, synthesizers in general had become more popular thanks to Stevie Wonder. And
TV sets were getting better, but you didn't have that huge jump. I remember I had the same TV set from 1990 through 2004. So it wasn't until 2004. I'm like, okay, TV is getting flatter. The color's getting sharper. It wasn't until HD, which really, I was like, okay, now I have to get a TV set. So yeah, you didn't have the same type of change in technology. Right. Although I will say by that time, you were having more of a sort of dedicated fan base. And so there was more context around some of the series and stuff like that. You had Star Trek books. You didn't have the internet. I guess
you did, the internet.
The internet wouldn't be for a few more years, but you still had a lot more discussion and reference around these particular episodes.
Just want to say that these have been a great couple of episodes to really compare and contrast, and there's always a lot to talk about.
They're fun to watch, and the more you dig into them, you sort of break them down, the more interesting they get, right? And again, taking the elements and comparing that to what's going on in the time period and the culture, you see them with a very different light. And there's a reason this is a franchise that has lasted 60 years almost, because it really gets to particular themes about humanity, about ethics, and about how people get along that continue to resonate and in many ways are timeless. Bye.
Bye.
This is Federations Generations.